Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. Thousands have taken to the streets in Turkey to pay their respects to 15-year-old Berkin Elvan, who died on Tuesday. Berkin died of injuries sustained in the Gezi Park protest last year. So the mobilisations were also a protest against embattled Prime Minister Erdogan. Clashes took place between police and protesters, resulting in 2 deaths, one of a protester and one of a policeman. Many more were injured. Erdogan has since condemned the protesters, and the European Parliament has seemingly stood by the Turkish government. Elvan's mother, on the other hand, has publicly blamed Erdogan for her son's death, and the protesters have chanted "Erdogan killer" and other anti-government slogans. So what do these new protests mean for Erdogan? First, let's take a look at this report, and then we'll be talking to my guests, Hakan Kamuz, who's chair of Turkey's Independent Industrialists and Businessmen's Association. Nesrin Fehmi is founder and editor of the North London-based Turkish language newspaper Olay Gazette, and on the line by Andrew Gardner, Amnesty International's researcher on Turkey. That's after this story.
The death of 15-year-old Berkin Elvan in Turkey has sparked off a fresh wave of unrest in the country as thousands took to the streets condemning the government. Elvan had been in a coma for 9 months after being shot by a police gas canister in the protests in Gezi Park last year. Thousands gathered for the funeral procession, but this scene stood in contrast to a reinvigorated street movement expressing their fury at what they see as the latest victim of an increasingly authoritarian government.
He went to buy bread at the age of 14, and now his dead body is being brought back home. We want all this to end. We do not want any incidents like this to happen in our country. People cannot be named as separatists just because of what they say their human rights are.
The protests in Gezi Park last year, against the bulldozing of one of the last green areas in Istanbul, sparked a wave of demonstrations throughout Turkey against the government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The issues range from what had been perceived as a creeping Islamization of the country through to an increasing gap between rich and poor. Government figures responded to the death of Berkin Elvan and stressed there should be no further outbreaks of violence.
I express my condolences to the family of the deceased and share their pain. I underline that everyone must be very careful not to let any new incident occur and allow any new pain to happen.
But the outrage is palpable. Speaking to reporters, Berkin's mother said, "It's not God who took my son away, but Prime Minister Erdogan." The unrest has come shortly after the controversial decision to release key figures in the notorious Ergenekon trial, a case which resulted in a significant weakening of military power in Turkey, for which Erdogan was originally lauded. General Ilker Bazberg was imprisoned for life, accused of organising an ultra-nationalist coup to overthrow the government. He is now free on a legal technicality. Many praised Erdogan when he broke the power of the military deep state in 2008 and put an end to repeated military coups. But with his threats to close Facebook and YouTube and the highest number of imprisoned journalists in the world, many are finding the atmosphere in his Turkey increasingly oppressive. Alex MacDonald, Islam Channel.
So welcome to the programme. Hakan, are these protests the same people that were on the streets over the Gezi Park, and who are they?
No, I mean, I would categorize them as sympathizers of the pain suffered by the family and the death of a young child. And so was I, and so was many millions in Turkey. Death of a child of 15-year-old is not acceptable by any standards. So it isn't about categorizing the society. It's the incident itself is quite saddening for everybody. So these people in the funeral of a young boy is not necessarily one section of society. I would say they represent Turkey and the pain suffered by the society in Turkey.
So you're saying that these are broader in terms of the people participating than the Gezi Park protests?
No, I mean, look, Gezi Park protest people and the people who attended the funeral of a young boy are not necessarily. I don't want to categorize them as one section of one society where they turn up to these things together. No, it isn't. Gezi Park protest was something completely different. This is a funeral, and I don't, to be honest with you, want to even affiliate it with that, because this is a pain. Death of a young child is not necessarily something even to be used in a political context, in my opinion.
Nesrin, do you agree with that?
Well, I think there's a connection with the Gezi Park, and I can only speak from outside, from London. I'm not in Turkey and I don't know the events. I can only look at it from my point of view. But I feel strongly, and I can see a connection with Gezi Park incident. I think that's why he's dead. So obviously it is connected. But as far as the demonstrators and the participants, obviously they use this as an excuse to attend these kind of meetings because they are against some of the policies of the current government. That's the way I see it.
I mean, okay. Just to add, sorry, one can understand if you wanted to oppose the policies of current government and you wanted to protest, that's understandable. What isn't understandable is utilizing a funeral of a young boy who died. This is a very tragic circumstances, and somehow.
Although it's a long tradition and not necessarily a disreputable one. I mean, in this country, often people. I mean, and he did die as part of a protest. So I mean, in this country, Irish funerals, Irish Republican funerals, have long been political protests. In South Africa,
what we're not affiliating, what we're not affiliating is we're not affiliating a 15-year-old child with a political movement and his death with a message of a political movement. That's what we're not affiliating.
Okay. Well, let me just go over to Andrew Gardner from Amnesty International. Andrew, how do you see it? You're in Istanbul, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right. And I was able to go to the funeral yesterday and take part and really see what was going on there. And it was really hundreds of thousands of people. Now estimates put the number of people taking part in the procession as up to 1 million. And what happened, in fact, is it turned into a huge anti-government protest with slogans shouted against the police, a lot of anger that the people who were responsible for the death of Berkin Elvan still haven't been brought to justice 9 months later, and anger at the government, which, as they see it, is protecting the perpetrators of this violence and not taking necessary steps to bring people to justice.
So do you think that this will reinvigorate the political protests? Do you think that they'll perhaps take place on a wider scale, or is that not likely?
I think there's been a protest movement which has obviously reached a kind of a peak last summer during the Gezi Park protest, but it hasn't been a situation that protests have died down since then. There were a lot of protests here in Istanbul and elsewhere in cities in Turkey, for example, related to the draconian internet law that was recently brought in to allow the government to block a lot of content on the internet. Changes that were made to the judiciary, which really increase executive control over judges and prosecutors, and this lingering anger at the use of police violence, at peaceful protests, and the complete failure to bring these abusers to justice. So this protest that we saw yesterday is part of a much wider anger at the human rights abuses committed by the Turkish authorities, and it's part of a much longer and ongoing protest movement.
Nassim, is that how you see it? That this is whatever the specific issue here, it's fitting into a broader pattern?
Well, there will be a lot more demonstrations. There will be a wave of demonstrations, and this is going to go on starting from Gezi Park, the way I see things. And this is going to be in London, in Europe, other places as well, because there is a certain portion of the Turkish population then that is protesting at any excuse. I use the word excuse because they're looking for excuse. There are instances to protest, as I said earlier, that they're against the government, certain government policies like your representative was saying. And there will not be an end to all this. But the way I also look at it is that Western countries, European countries, expecting Turkish politics, Turkish democracy to work at the same level as in the West is not going to happen now. So there is an element of Western media as well, or television, newspapers, actually not helping the situation by enlarging it and bringing it up to today, because Turkey is a totally different country compared with Europe. It's a new democratic country. It's only 90 years old after 600 years of Ottoman Empire, Muslim rule So we need time. I think the way I see things, that it needs time, and things has to be. Yes, there are things that I personally oppose as well to AKP party or its policies. But on the other hand, when I look back the 90 years democracy in Turkey, all other parties also didn't do as much.
Or perhaps it's the other way around. Perhaps Turkish democracy is functioning precisely like older democracies do. Corruption, well, they've certainly got them. Take a look at Italy. Attempts to limit civil liberties, well, that's pretty universal. And protests, that's what keeps a democracy alive. So kind of what's wrong with this picture?
There is nothing wrong with this picture. I mean, the most demonstrations will take place in Turkey, like my colleague's saying. And that is part of democracy, right? I mean, people have right to express their frustrations, their ideas and their thoughts and where they stand. And but when it becomes violent and they start smashing shops and burning public buses and attacking people, that is just beyond what we expect as norm, which is what happens in Turkey, where then government takes a position, then that's been portrayed even by Amnesty as heavy-handed response. How could you talk about heavy-handed response or measures they take when they're actually trying to protect others' right to exist whilst the protests are going on?
Let me just put that point to Andrew. Was that right, Andrew? Was it a heavy-handed response? Were Amnesty right to say that?
I think there are a couple of points. It was said earlier that people are looking for any excuse to protest, but if you look how the Gezi Park protest started, it was actually a very small group of people, around 200 or 300 environmentalists, who were thrown out of the park by police using, yes, very heavy-handed techniques. And it was this anger that these young people weren't allowed to use their democratic right to protest, and this extreme police violence, which resulted in these protests sparking and engaging a much larger group of people. Now, as Amnesty International, we've called on the protesters to keep their demonstrations peaceful. And it is true that on occasions there are people who throw stones at police and engage in other acts of violence. But let's be very clear on this. The vast majority of these protests have been peaceful, and they have been met by completely unnecessary, disproportionate and extreme violence by police officers, including beatings, the use of tear gas, including firing tear gas canisters directly at people at scene of demonstrations. One of them was Berkin Erdogan, who died as a result of it. And this has resulted in the further protests. So
by the same token,
I think it should be...
Andrew, by the same token, by your measure, would you not then say some elements in police force have done these, and not just accuse the whole government of using heavy-handed tactics like Amnesty always do? Would you want to give me the justice on that?
I think there is a clear responsibility to bring the individual police officers responsible for actions.
I agree.
If you let me finish, responsible for the actions such as those that resulted in the death of Berkin Erdogan. But there is also responsibility on the government to have a responsible police service, and the responsibility on the government to calm the response. And statements like the Prime Minister urging even greater force against the demonstrators, to say that the police were the victims of the violence, to say that the police actions were legendary. This is something which has increased the tensions and increased the level of violence, and has given police a free rein to behave in the way that they did.
His statements were not any different than the statements of Theresa May or David Cameron.
When the channel gives you a programme, that's when you'll be chairing it. In the meantime, I'm doing it. Nassim, come on, because you haven't had a word here.
One word what I was saying that, yes, as I was explaining earlier, yeah, there is many demonstrators that mix up with the genuine demonstrators, and the whole thing turns into something different. But I think the first initiative has to come from Erdogan by coming open to the public, because I've watched him on television many times myself. I don't live in Turkey, but I listen to his words. He is most of the time forgetting that he's a public servant. He's prime minister, but he's a public servant. He's going beyond that line and trying to teach everybody morality and ethics. And that's where the problem starts.
You mean that the statements come across as partisan statements, not
From
as...
him trying to tell people what is right and wrong. A prime minister's job is not to teach ethics and morality to people. Their job is to do politics.
I disagree. I totally disagree. I mean, every prime minister, you and I live in this country, every prime minister came and gone, talked about basic moral rights.
On television and tell
Yeah,
me
but
I can't drink a
everyone
glass of
talks about
wine.
moral rights. This is the prime minister. It is part and parcel of prime minister's job in every country.
That's why these are going to go on.
You're managing the society.
If
You're
he
running
comes
a
out
country.
One at a time,
openly
gentlemen.
and does his job, these demonstrations will die down.
You're not appointing the bureaucrats. He's a prime minister. He represents
Well,
the
he's
will
going
of
to tell
people.
me what film to watch, how many children to make,
No, come on.
and what drink
These
to
are
drink.
semantics.
Come
Those are
on.
semantics.
We're moving towards the end of the
I've
programme.
listened to him personally myself on television.
Although-
the presenter asking him, what about those people who drink one glass of wine a week or something? They're also alcoholic, he's saying. This is a prime minister.
He's a Muslim prime minister. Of course, he
Muslim?
has his own
What does it
moral
matter?
values.
What does it matter, Muslim or
He may
Christian?
not agree with drinking alcohol. What's wrong with that?
Okay, John,
No,
we're going to
no,
have to stop
no
it there
prime
because
minister gonna
hang
tell me
on,
what I
hang on,
can
no,
drink.
because we're coming towards the break, and any minute now you can continue this discussion afterwards. But we'll be continuing this discussion in the second half of the programme after the break, so please do rejoin us.